Welcome, everyone, to the Anatomy of a Film podcast. I'm your host, Bill Griff here. Today, we have our two other co-hosts. This is Eugenio,
Oh, you can call me Eugene or Eugenio, whatever you want.
whatever's easiest for your tongue to pronounce. And then the third is Little Souffle.
Hello.
And that's it. And that's all we'll hear from him for the rest of the podcast.
That's my entire input.
This is our
Okay.
first episode ever, which is kind of crazy. It took a long time for us to get together for this moment.
Yeah.
I remember Eugenio coming to me with this idea, probably, oh God, I want to say September, maybe even
Yeah.
August of last year.
No, it has to be August.
It was so long ago, long enough that I don't even know. Well, whenever the Sight and Sound list came out, that is when the idea was brought forward. And as soon as he told me about it, I was convinced this would be a great idea, not just for a podcast, but just to talk about films together, because we're all pretty good friends, the three of us, and we all like to have our banter and our discussion on film, and what better way than to do it through this medium?
Yeah, and not only are we starting with the Anatomy of a Film podcast today we're starting a series within the podcast that we're naming the A Matter of Sight and Sound series. The whole idea is to go just through the entire list of the Sight and Sound list that came out in 2022. For those who don't know, the Sight and Sound list, it's a list that's made every 10 years. It started back in 1962, I believe. It could have been 1952. And since then, every 10 years, BFI, the British Film Institute, assembles a series of critics and directors to vote on 10 films that they think are the best films of all time. They leave the criterion to each of the individuals voting. They then tally up all the votes and create a list. And recently in 2022 we had the latest installment, and we just thought that the Sight and Sound list, as flawed as it may be, it just contains so many films from so many different countries and continents and the eras of film from like the 1910s all the way to the 2020s.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, you can kind of see the Sight and Sound list as like the current canon according to like
Yeah.
the filmmakers, because it is voted by like reputable, pretty respectable people in the film community, like a bunch of important directors, film critics. So like it is super fascinating to see like basically like the quote unquote heads of the avant-garde film industry, see what they come up with as like the quote unquote best movies. And it is a really fascinating list. Like I know there's snubs that we wish were there, but like overall I think it's pretty solid, the films that are here.
And the meta is constantly changing with the lists. Looking back,
Yeah, and the list is such a like interesting reflection of how the meta changes. Recently, in this latest installment of the list, there were more female-directed films added than any other of the Sight and Sound lists ever, all the way to like, of course, number one. And yeah, and to what Souffle was saying about people who vote on the list, Roger Ebert was famously on record saying that's the only list he participated in voting, and other big people in the industry like Martin Scorsese have casted ballots every year. They've been invited to.
and this year we've got Chris Stuckman, Karsten Runquist, and Jeremy Johns with their entries.
I'm like, careful. YMS voted for Uncle Booed Me to be on there
I'd like to think so.
in an ideal world.
This list is great to talk about in a podcast setting because of how diverse it is, really. You kind of
Yeah.
have a film from every genre imaginable. You have war films, sci-fi films, snuff films, horror, comedy, action, noir. It's really endless. Every spectrum of the film medium is discussed.
I don't know, it's very lacking in the rom-com
Yeah.
department.
Well, if only Happy Gilmore was in here.
But you're right. Like it literally goes from show a 10-hour documentary in the Holocaust to Pink Flamingos and Possession and Citizen Kane,
The
Killer of
Birds.
Sheep, and The Birds and everything in between.
Crash.
Crash. The good Crash. The 1996 Cronenberg Crash.
Define good.
Yeah, define good.
Okay, you're right.
I love Crash.
I like Crash. I guess we're gonna talk about that another day. But how have you guys been recently? Have you tasted some more AMC wine, Souffle?
I love AMC wine. Yeah, I went to go see Poor Things the other day.
Oh,
It was
nice.
like a week ago now. Me and a friend went. Thoroughly enjoyed it. One of my favorites of the year.
Interesting. Wait, did you actually really like it?
Yeah. What do you mean?
Why?
Is this a bit?
No, I enjoyed it a lot.
I'm just asking. You said that May December was like the only film you really enjoyed from last year.
No, no, no. I said that May, December, and Poor Things were the only movies I
Oh.
thoroughly loved this year, unfortunately. I mean, there was a lot of great movies, just not any I would like revisit personally.
I'm not gonna get too deep into May December. I enjoyed it more when I watched it, but it hasn't aged that well in my head.
Oh, that's so
Uh,
unfortunate. That was such a
yeah.
great theater experience when we saw it. Not enough millimeters. I missed out on Crash on 35 today, actually. But yeah, what about you, Bill? What have you seen recently?
Recently, I've been rewatching a lot of movies from my favorites lists. The Safdie Bros, Good Time, Prisoners. I also watched The Oregonian, which is definitely not on my favorites list. That movie
What
was
year?
very different, very, very different. But I'm glad I finally saw it. The poster was very intriguing. You know, it was discount Kermit the Frog covered in blood. Shout out to the Blair if she's listening in on this podcast, our fellow Oregonian. She said it was a very accurate representation of the community there. I beg to differ, but that's cool to know. But yeah, other than that, I've been pretty good. Been pretty good. My only mildly scarred from that film.
I can't believe it's not in your favorites list.
Talking
Maybe
about
next time.
Scarred, I recently watched Kuo Varisaida.
Oh,
That movie,
Really?
yeah.
I didn't see you log that. That's interesting.
Oh, yeah, it's a really great movie, I thought. The Balkan Wars and especially the Bosnian War is not really covered that much in Western media, and it's a really interesting topic. And it's insane how recently it was, less than 30 years ago. The Bosnian War was like the bloodiest conflict in Europe since World War II,
Oh yeah.
except for the current Russia-Ukraine war. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna get deep into the Bosnian War, but I think everybody should just look into it at some point. The details of the Balkan War and the fall of Yugoslavia.
Yeah, Koisvida has been in my radar for a while. I've been meaning to check it out. I know Bill recommended to me that movie so many times.
I love that film.
Do you guys want to start talking about the movie, or is there something else you guys want to talk about, like the sponsor of today's video?
Squarespace.
AMC Wine, AMC Stubs,
Nicole
AMC 3.
Kidman.
Today's sponsor, it's MGM.
What? MGM, yes.
No, MGM, you're not sponsoring us. This is our decision.
Yeah, that MGM is not sponsoring.
Yeah. I'm sorry, MGM. If you want to sponsor us, we won't let you.
We've denied the request.
Okay, so the movie we're going to talk about today is number 108 on the Sight and Sound list. And you may be wondering, why are we doing 108 as opposed to 264 or number 1 or number 100 or whatever? The reason is because we're going to do the entire list from number 1 to 264. We're doing it in a specialized random order, and we're going to be starting with The Wizard of Oz. Later, at the end of the podcast, we're going to discuss quote unquote, what is going to be next week's movie. Today's movie is 1939's MGM Technicolor classic, The Wizard of Oz, directed by several directors, but primarily Victor Fleming, starring Judy Garland and Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, and Brett Lahr, Frank Morgan, and Margaret Hamilton, etc., etc., etc. The movie, of course, most people will have seen it. We're gonna talk fully with spoilers for every discussion, but yeah. Young Dorothy finds herself in a magical world where she makes friends with a lion, a scarecrow, and a tin man. As they make their way along the yellow brick road to talk with a wizard and ask for the things they miss most in their lives, the Wicked Witch of the West is the only thing that could stop them. The film has become an absolute classic. The Library of Congress named it the most watched film in history. It is basically one of the most, if not the most, influential film of all time, especially when it comes to popular culture. Just so that we can get these out of the way. There's a whole conflict that I mentioned quite briefly ago, but the whole thing about the multiple directors that made the film.
There were 6, if I'm not mistaken, right?
What's stranger to me is because I know there was like the pre-production was kind of a mess, right? When it came
Yeah.
to all these movie directors. But like Victor Fleming gets the sole credit in a lot of like it just says directed by Victor Fleming in comparison to something like Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz really only credits Victor Fleming nowadays, and I wonder why that is.
Most places where you would look, like The Wizard of Oz, you'll find that the director is Victor Fleming. Same with Gone with the Wind. Both movies produced by MGM in 1939. And so many people are like, oh, then why is Victor Fleming not considered one of the best directors when they just look at his credits? But the truth is that, yeah, like these directors worked under MGM, under the studio system. So they were kind of like tied by contract by MGM and could only work with MGM. And instead of them choosing their own films and writing and directing their own screenplays, they would just direct whatever movie MGM wanted them to direct. And before going into why Victor Fleming is the most credited, so the film had 6 directors in total, starting with Norman Torog, who did the pre-production of the film and was initially announced as the film's director, but then got fired 3 days before shooting or somewhere around there. Then his replacement was Richard Thorpe, and Richard Thorpe was fired after 12 days. And after Richard Thorpe was fired, he got replaced by George Cukor, who you might recognize from directing films such as The Philadelphia Story. The thing about George Cukor is that in those 3 days, he basically put the film on track to what it became. Before him, Richard Thorpe had Judy Garland dressed with a blonde wig and silly makeup to look like a doll, and he had her act basically like a very exaggerated 4-year-old girl. And then George Cukor, in those 3 days, got rid of the wig and the makeup and told Judy Garland to act as herself, as Dorothy. Which gave her, even if the Judy Garland's portrayal or performance is not really like realistic, quote unquote, or like very down to earth, still like that was George Cukor's making. And then Victor Fleming took over. And Cukor went on to direct Gone with the Wind. But the producer, who we're going to be discussing later, is Melvin Leroy. He liked what Cukor had done with the direction, and he just told Victor Fleming to run along with Cukor's vision. So Fleming just stayed on that path, and of course had to reshoot most of what the previous directors had shot. I don't think George Cukor even got a chance to shoot one scene. And after Fleming took over, he did direct most of the film. He directed most of the scenes in Oz. Fleming went on to work with Gone with the Wind, because Gone with the Wind was the big MGM production of 39, and The Wizard of Oz was like a side movie. And it was also MGM's response to Disney's 1937 hit with children, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And so King Vidor then took over after Victor Fleming, and King Vidor you may recognize from another film we're going to be discussing later in the podcast, The Crowd, one of the most pioneering and influential films of all time, and so is King Vidor, one of the biggest pioneers in film history. And The Crowd came out 11 years-ish before this. So he did some of the Munchkin sequences, and then he did all of the Kansas scenes. So there you go. Those are all the 6 directors that worked on The Wizard of Oz. And I think Fleming got the credit because he did most of the sequences. And I think they just needed to stamp a director because I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but like I know that at least like way after this in the 1990s and 1980s, the Coen brothers would usually credit only Joel Coen as the director and Ethan Coen as the producer because with a double director they wouldn't be eligible for getting an Oscar nomination. So maybe MGM thought the same and would just credit one director while all the other directors got like shafted basically.
Yeah, because they don't even have producer
No.
or co-director credits either.
Yeah, only King Vidor has a co-director credit. None of the other 4 have.
Okay.
But yeah.
Interesting.
Well, that makes sense considering Norman wasn't even able to be in the production. He left a few days before. Thorpe, all of his scenes were scrapped. Cukor, he had a great vision for the film, but he didn't shoot any scenes as far as we know. So it makes sense why none of the others were technically given that kind of credit.
Yeah. Oh, and also I forgot. I mentioned just 5 there. The 6th director is is the producer himself, Mervyn Leroy, who just directed a couple scenes as he was like a stand-in. I'm pretty sure if I were to guess, I'm not sure if there's not like concrete information as to what he directed, but if I were to guess, I think he probably directed some of the segments after Fleming went. It's either after Fleming got ascended and King Vidor took over, or before Fleming and after Cukor. Maybe that was time.
It might have been between the two of them. I feel like that makes the most sense because Fleming really liked Cukor's vision and definitely pushed Fleming to do that. Yeah.
And Mervyn Leroy, he was like pretty fundamental to the success of The Wizard of Oz and just The Wizard of Oz to be made in general. And to a certain extent, it makes sense. It's more of it's a weird case of like not author theory at all. There's not really
No,
any director vision or individual vision behind the movie. There's, as we said, 6 directors. And also, this is kind of crazy, but there were 19 writers.
Jesus.
Some of them we will never see. We never saw any of their work in the movie. They probably did drafts and then got fired. But the main screenwriters were Noel Langley, Edgar Allan Wolfe, and Florence Ryerson. Those were the head screenwriters, and among the notable other writers, there was Herman Mankiewicz, who is brother of Joseph Mankiewicz, most famous for
Oh.
directing Cleopatra and Guys and Dolls, and of course All About Eve. Herman Mankiewicz is, of course, pretty famous himself for writing none other than Citizen Kane, and also, well, he had a movie made about him a couple years ago, Mank, directed by David Fincher.
Can't
Yeah.
believe he canceled Mindhunters for that shit. Terrible.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Mindhunter season 2 is coming soon.
See, yeah, coming
Probably.
soon.
Still on the pre-production aspect of it all, which to me is the most fascinating part of this film. Like, because it's a film that should not work by just like all the
Yeah.
cooks in the kitchen and all the facets behind it. But another fascinating thing to me was like the overlap between this and Gone with the Wind. If you want to elaborate on that a little bit, because I know you know a lot of the minutia behind that.
I mean, Gone with the Wind. I mean, we've talked about this. I mean, it's pop culture trivia, I guess. But Gone with the Wind was seen as like the biggest movie at the time. It won 10 Oscars. It was, and it still is, the highest-grossing film of all time. It grossed $400 million back in 1939. It could have been 400 or 300 million dollars, but that's like
I can see that right now.
that's like 3 times what Avatar earned at the box office. It's like $6 billion in today's money. And remember that at the time, movie tickets were just a quarter, and like a dime for children. Well, not many children would go see Gone with the Wind, but still. And it's also a 4-hour film. Crazy, but yeah. So MGM worked with both films, was making both films, and that was their adult box office drama. It was everything, and this movie was just like their kids' movie. They're both pretty influential movies. There was an article I saw the other day claiming that the most influential movie of all time was The Wizard of Oz, and the fifth one was the Gone with the Wind. The Gone with the Wind. Blair would be proud.
Yeah, because like, correct me if I'm wrong, but when these two films were being made, MGM was like basically Gone with the Wind was going to be their cash pony. Like they're
Yeah,
putting everything into it, and like Wizard of Oz was kind of like the ugly duckling.
it was.
Um,
Yeah,
and it
and
didn't even do. Did it win its money back in release?
no,
No, right?
it didn't. No, it didn't, which is really interesting.
As important as Gone with the Wind was, you can definitely see its influence in pop culture, like not that significant. Nowhere near to the level of Wizard of Oz. Like it's crazy
Yeah,
how, because Wizard of Oz is probably like the most important American movie in the canon,
yeah,
just based off like how influential it is. Not to say that like the Sight and Sound list is the Bible of like film canon, of
of course
course
not.
not. But like the Wizard of Oz is here and Gone with the Wind isn't, which is interesting, you know.
Yeah, and it of course Gone with the Wind aged poorly because of its portrayal of slaves, obviously. And back to what you were saying about earning its money back. So yeah, The Wizard of Oz didn't actually earn its money on release. It earned its money back 10 years later in 1949 because back then when a movie was out of the theater, there was no TV, no rental, no nothing. Like the movie was out of the cinema and gone forever. And it wasn't until 1946 that they started doing reruns. Well, not reruns, but like they started playing it in the theater again. And it garnered more popularity among soldiers coming home because of its whole theme about like missing home. Um, the soldiers coming home from the war in Europe. And so 3 years later, in 1949, it became a bigger hit and it earned its money back. And it's interesting because its budget back in 1939 was of $3 million. With inflation, that's like 68 or 78 million dollars of today's money. But no, as you said, it's like really interesting to think of like the whole idea of all these cooks in the kitchen, but it still has like this kind of uniform vision, which I guess is Cooker's vision, but it's all under MGM. and under the MGM like machine. So it's actually like really interesting how good the movie is for what it is.
Yeah, because it like reservations of it not being my cup of tea aside, like it is such a pretty well structured movie. Like it does not feel incoherent or like messy at all. Like it's
Yeah.
very well structured and like definitely has a thorough line, and like it does not like I would have does not seem to me like it has 19 writers and 6 directors attached to it. But at the same time, it is still like very much like you said, like a producer movie. So like it coincides with like the producer's narrative in a way.
An interesting tidbit about like the production of the film, which I don't see ever being discussed. But this film was slated to be in the first ever Palme d'Or, look, Cannes Film Festival, and it was nominated for the Palme d'Or.
Really?
Yeah, the festival was supposed to happen in September of 1939. I wonder what happened on the 1st of September of
Oh,
1949.
Someone was off to see the wizard, right?
yep.
Yeah, but it's actually a really interesting story about how the 1939, the 1939 Cannes Film Festival and how the film festival came to be. Because we're going to be talking about the Cannes Film Festival a lot, I think, during the entire podcast.
Oh yeah, they're gonna be regulars.
Yeah, the first ever Palme d'Or, Cannes Film Festival was after, I think it was somewhere early in 1938, it could be late 1938. There was gonna be a lot of producers from all over the world and critics and whatever went to the Venice Film Festival, but based on definitely not rigged votes, the Italian film won because Mussolini definitely had nothing to do with it. No, but yeah, so Mussolini rigged the Venice Film Festival so that an Italian propaganda film would win, and they also rigged it so that a German film would win another prize. And so basically, other critics from like foreign countries, not Italian, they were like, okay, that's not fair. Let's just start our own film festival that has no politics attached, and that's what they like did, and that's how the Cannes Film Festival came to be. So they were ready to open like a month before, and then they had to cancel. Even a couple people had gone to Cannes to be ready for the festival, and then they had to leave early because of the tensions rising in Europe, and then the tension exploded, and so the festival got canceled, and it wasn't like retaken until 1946 when the war was over. That's where we got our first Cannes Film Festival.
Wow.
But what's actually interesting is that all the way in 2002, 63 years later, the Cannes Film Festival organized an event to actually give the Palme d'Or to all the films. Well, they did other votes and other like competitions to give a Palme d'Or to the films released in 1939 to 1945. And so films like Rome Open City won, or Xochimilco, which is a Mexican film. And The Wizard of Oz lost in 2002 against Cecil B. DeMille's Union Pacific, which is kind of funny because that movie's never mentioned, especially compared to The Wizard of Oz. But it won the Palme d'Or in 2002.
No, that's all very fascinating.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think how like it's a world war. It literally affected everything, and like it's one of the major events in cinema history.
Just cinema history.
Yeah, of course, that's what I mean. Like it affected every single aspect of life, and it's really
Yeah.
a turning point for cinema as well. Not only because of this, but like because of the birth of Italian neorealism and all those other. But yeah, it is definitely like an interesting film when it comes to like even the production drama. I don't know if you guys have heard of. Have you heard anything, Bill, from the productions drama?
Too
The
much.
Wizard of Oz.
Too much. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the cast members? Do you want to start with the treatment of the Munchkin actors? Do you want to talk about the many, many, many injuries that happened? I feel like so many people know about it though at this point. Like what happened to the Wicked Witch of the West, the actress Margaret Hamilton getting blown up, caught on fire.
Yeah.
The terrible makeup on the Tin Man that caused the previous actor to be hospitalized. The Scarecrow getting burned in the arm, the Cowardly Lion's costume being too heavy. It really goes on. Like there's so much terror. There's so much terror. They even used
I know.
asbestos snow back then. If you tick off all the hazard lists of old pre-1950 films, The Wizard of Oz ticks off almost every single one of those. It's crazy. It's
It's
as
so
Souffle would
crazy.
as Souffle would say, it was egregious what
It was
happened.
egregious.
Yeah.
Very egregious.
Yeah. Oh, I remember a controversy, which is so ridiculous. But the Munchkins, the other day, Souffle asked, I think, like, how did they get so many?
The way that's terrible.
The way that it was asked was just
How did they
Yeah.
get
I
so
was like,
many?
How did they get so
how,
many
why are there
Munchkins?
so many of them?
Yeah. There were actually 120, somewhere between 122 and 124.
Wow.
They were from a performers group from Poland escaping the war because many of them were Jewish, and it's really interesting because they would get paid $50 a week, which is roughly 1,000 of today's dollars. But Toto, the dog, would get paid almost 3 times that much. He would get paid $125 a week.
Oh yeah, Terry the dog, who was also
Sure.
injured during production.
Oh yeah, he was.
So
He got stepped
one of
on by
one of those Wicked Witch soldiers, or one of the
oh
flying monkeys. One of those two
yeah,
stepped on
the
his
winged
tail.
monkeys. Yeah, yeah, the
But
guards from
like,
the castle.
what do you mean injured? Because step on a tail happens
No, he
a
didn't
lot.
step on the tail. I think he just stepped on him.
Oh
and
fuck.
and he was like, Terry was like couldn't act for like 2 weeks, and I know that they really struggled to like make Terry follow them, or like Toto follow them during their singing when they go like, we're off to see the wizard, and they're all like running.
Yeah.
That poor dog.
It was so
God.
brutal. Oh yeah, poor dog, poor everybody.
Didn't the actress of Dorothy try to buy him or like own him afterward?
Oh yeah, Judy Garland wanted to own him, but the owner didn't want to part ways, which is fair.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
kind of crazy.
I mean, she was only 16 when she was in that movie and became like a huge movie star.
An
Yeah,
icon.
it was between
Yeah.
her and
So you were gonna say something and I interrupted you so rudely. Sorry.
Shirley Temple for the role of Dorothy.
Oh,
But
interesting. I didn't know
I'm,
that.
I'm glad they went with Judy Garland over her.
Oh yeah,
Apparently,
I fucking hate
well,
Shirley Temple.
I don't hate Shirley Temple, but I heard that her singing capabilities were definitely not up to par in comparison to Garland. But
Mhm.
Oh, there was a moment in the film which I think is really well in the production, talking about production drama, which I thought was really crazy. But there's this one scene. I think it's the Cowardly Lions song or introduction. And when he came out of like the woods, Judy Garland would just be like laughing so hard. She'd be like in hysterics. Like she couldn't stop laughing, and so they couldn't get the take. And so director Victor Fleming got so fed up, and he just like grabbed her and he slapped her across the face. And you can actually still see her giggling in like the actual take that they used. And he slapped her, and then after they finished filming the scene, he felt so bad that he was like, please somebody punch me in the face so that I can feel better. And like Judy Garland said like, oh, there's no need, and then she gave him a kiss on I think the cheek or the nose. And again, she was 16. It's such a crazy
that's
story.
a little creepy,
Yeah,
That's a little
it's a little
strange, to say the least.
a little bad.
it's
Yeah,
it's so
fucked
bad.
up. I
It's so
feel like
ridiculous.
there's just based off that story, I feel like there's a lot more that we will never hear about, never know about. But
Yeah,
just from what we gather, I mean, it sounded like a shitstorm with
it did.
the production of Wizard of Oz. Just the fact that they had to juggle 6 different egos in the director's chair just to begin with,
Yeah,
and 19 screenwriters, including Mank
yeah.
himself.
So insane.
Terrible.
That's
Oh
what
yeah,
I'm saying. That even with the too many cooks in the kitchen, but like even like all these production, many people getting injured, like everything is against this movie, and yet it somehow is
great.
structured pretty well, and you don't really get any of that through the film. It's so interesting.
No.
Yeah.
It
Oh, I
feels
rem.
wholesome when you watch it. Yeah, it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like there's anything dark or disturbing underneath of what happened.
It's no Suicide
Not at
Squad.
all.
No, yeah,
And
ooh.
yeah, it's so weird because it's like it's one of the clearest examples to me of like quote unquote movie magic. It just, I don't know, it feels like it was destiny that this movie would work, and it became so famous. Oh, and we talked there earlier about the money, like how it didn't um earn its money back until 1949, but it didn't become a classic until CBS played it on TV in 1956, where it drew 45 million viewers. I don't know
Yeah.
what the population of the US was in 1956, but it's probably somewhere around 200 million, maybe a little bit less, possibly a little bit more. So it's like a fourth of the country tuning in to watch one film in one night.
Wouldn't
I
that
mean, that was also the baby boom generation.
Yeah, that was very early, early after the baby boomers.
So it's like it kind of like I don't know, because like I feel like this film has resurgence of like the certain generations, like the people who came back from World War II and like the baby boom generation. It's like it's such an American movie that it just appeals to like the quote unquote like American homey like no place like home like vibes. You know what I mean? So why it's so that's why it's become a kind of a classic in American culture in a way.
wouldn't it be defined as a cult classic too because the fact that it was not recognized until the next generation?
Yeah.
I mean, it got a
I
couple of
mean,
Oscar
yes and no.
nominations and stuff. It got a couple. It got some recognition when it came out. Some people really
It's just
hated it.
way too popular to like.
Oh, I saw a critic. I saw a review by a critic. I don't even remember who it was, but it was such a funny review. He was like, "Oh, they will never get to Disney's level. Disney's the owner of this. It's just a petty attempt to steal from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs." So funny.
It kind of was at the time.
Yeah.
Oh, and also one interesting thing about Victor Fleming, of all people. So I read an article the other day in which an MGA head producer, Pandro Bergman, not Bergman, Bergman, was interviewed, and then he was asked like if producers deserve more credit than directors when talking about MGM. And then the quote is, "I would say so, except in the case of one man. Victor Fleming was such a powerful man and so strong that he wouldn't do anything until it was his way." Which I think it goes back to the conversation we were having, like almost at the beginning, with how Victor Fleming's role gets like maybe overblown as to what he did, but he gets his recognition here at least, which is interesting. It's interesting that the MGM directors really looked up to him. I do think, I mean, he here it says that he wouldn't do anything until he had his way, but I have a feeling that he really worked well with the system, and that's why he kept getting promoted and promoted until he got like to work with Gone with the Wind, which also has like four directors, including George Cukor, King Vidor, and Victor Fleming.
I mean, surely he's definitely at least somewhat very because like talented because like doing both Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz around the same time, both very like grandiose movies in some ways. One could say Gone with the Wind's a bit more epic, but like both are very. I can't imagine directing that either of those things. Even though it's still very like producer led, it's still like a daunting task.
It must have been like super stressful, especially Gone with the Wind that had so many extras and so many things going on at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, Wizard of Oz is like has so much shit happening on set. Like we we've talked about all the problems, like the all the munchkins, all like the goblins or whatever they are,
Oh yeah,
and like the set pieces and the costumes and everything.
it's so bad.
It is extravagant though
MGM.
to look back
It
on.
is yeah, it is extravagant.
Yeah, and it also kind of led the way because MGM is like the big musical house when it comes to production houses or production companies.
Hmm.
MGM is like the big musical one. It's like, oh, that's Singing in the Rain and They had Gene Kelly and A Star Is Born with Judy Garland, but this one, it wasn't their first.
At least one component of The Wizard of Oz's production that stayed intact throughout its entire run was Harold Rawson's cinematography, which is fucking outstanding throughout the film. And if you
Yeah.
don't know, other films he's done is Singing in the Rain, The Asphalt Jungle, Dorado, so many great films, really. And it's no coincidence The Wizard of Oz looks stunning with his cinematography.
Yeah, it definitely looks very fantastical and magical. Like there's a lot of life in every shot. That can also be attributed to the art design of a lot of the sets and
Yeah.
stuff.
So many of the images are just so iconic and recognizable just in like 2 seconds, and just feels so magical. And I think it's largely due to cinematography.
Did you guys read about how Harold Rawson was interviewed about his cinematography work on the film, and that when they were working with Judy Garland and the actor who plays Tin Man, Jack Haley, their costumes were so reflective of any sort of light surface that it took him and the camera operators forever to get the right shots down, especially for the ruby slippers and the Tin Man's, his whole getup. He was entirely made of chrome reflective material. And usually for the time, they only had about 1 to 2 cameras per film, but they had at least 8 cameras on several scenes, especially coordinated dance scenes where the actors had to move a lot and they had to keep track of these light sources to make sure that it didn't blind the camera because hundreds of takes were taken. Hundreds of takes were taken on several of these scenes because of that problem they had. I can only imagine the amount of headaches that man must have had while making this movie.
The shared headaches. I have no idea how long the production was. It must have been like, I don't know. Like,
I read it was around 6 months in total.
That's insane to me.
yeah, that's actually pretty crazy. Now that I
That's
think
like
about it.
that's like a TV series right there, like a season's television worth.
I think that's even more.
Yeah, it's like Game of
Uh,
Thrones season 3 and 4. That
Storm of
that got
Swords.
that got souffle.
It's so funny.
Game of Thrones.
He's just
Famous.
for those watching, Souffle's just recently started the series. He's on episode 4 of season 4.
He's in
I
episode
have
4, Cripples,
notes for
Bastards,
what
and Broken
happened. Please.
Things.
He's
He
at the
really, really, really loves Ned
but
Stark.
anyways, enough about Game of Thrones. Let's
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, let's follow
For the
the yellow.
listeners,
Yeah,
I have read the books. I am not
let's
on episode 4.
let's follow the
He's on
let's
chapter
follow
4
the
of the first one.
uh, let's
Please.
Yeah,
let's
let's go back. All right, we're done.
yeah, let's
Yeah,
follow
but
the yellow brick road as opposed to the King's Road. For real.
good idea. Yeah, I remember when you were telling me about the Second Life, the revival of the film through the television reruns,
Mhm.
1956 to the 70s, and just how that film was able to tap into the generation as opposed to the generation it was intended for, the post Great Depression, which is a whole
Yeah.
other story on its own. We could get into that if you guys want, or we could just
Yeah.
try to like dive right into the film but apply it to that era of history because I feel like the Great Depression is a huge allegory for the mindset of the Kansas setting in The Wizard of Oz, the black and white, the lifeless, the cold, the hopelessness that Judy Garland's character has in those opening 20 minutes, the escapism, which is probably very apparent with how the society in the US were feeling in that time.
It is like the sepia, whatever, however you say it. Like the thing that makes the black and white footage look brown. Um, that all is very reminiscent of the Dust Bowl. On all the images of the Dust Bowl that like really affected the U.S. and the rest of the world by proxy during the Great Depression and the post-Great Depression world. And it happened around Kansas and like all the neighboring states like Iowa and stuff. Uh, But yeah, it's really interesting. Well, I don't know if Iowa neighbors Kansas. It doesn't, by the way. Okay, just they would have aided me.
Well, we know
But
Ohio doesn't exist. We can take that
we know
off.
Ohio doesn't exist. No, but yeah. So the Dust Bowl, and it's really interesting how in a post Great Depression world, which feels that is kind of what the Wizard of Oz speaks to, all this idea of like the world being so terrible because of like the economic hit that the whole world took and its effects for the following years. And so it's really interesting how like the film takes this idea of like, oh, the world, you don't not appreciate the world, so you go into like this escapist land over the rainbow. And there's this one shot that I really think it's very encompasses all the ideas of escapism within the film and that is when Dorothy opens the door after getting through the tornado. She opens the door and then she enters into Oz, and so she leaves the black and white behind, and it's like a Technicolor marvel in front of her, and she's just like she escaped into her own mind. She's no longer in Kansas. She's not in Kansas anymore. I don't know why I messed that up.
They were definitely trying to embody that feeling towards the audience of stepping into this new era in filmmaking, this new future, this hope, this joy, this vibrancy. Because at the time there were not that many Technicolor films. At least it wasn't a popularized medium
Yeah,
back in the day.
no,
So yeah, Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz were two of the first to do it and to popularize it, I should say, in the U.S.
yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing also about what you were well, when it comes to the color, I think it's really interesting how color is so essential to the film. We can talk about the whole meaning of the red shoes and the changes of making them red, but and the yellow brick road and all that. But it's just so important to the film. The color, of course, the yellow brick road. It's yellow. Glinda is all pink. Emerald City.
I love how you
The
said that.
How
the em-
insightful.
the Emerald City is so emeraldy. It's so
It's so
green.
emerald green. The Wicked
Yeah.
Witch is so
It's green.
green.
Yeah, Dorothy's dress being blue, and like how, I mean, we'll get to this later, but like the whole idea of like the ruby slippers being red, the yellow brick road being yellow, and the dress being blue, and so you have all three primary colors kind of working with one another, and yeah, and also back to what we were saying about the Great Depression. Um, so the Wizard of Oz is based on a series of books. Well, basically just one book called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, but it's one of like 15 maybe in the Land of Oz, written by
Frank L. Baum, I believe.
Frank Elbaum. Yeah, and in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and of course the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl hadn't happened yet. And the story when she's in Kansas, it's actually more reminiscent of the 1850s American droughts, which it just goes to show like the whole idea of like history rhymes, just like history repeating itself over and over, and how what could work for children in the 18 well in the late 1800s who are living through the economic effects caused by the 1850s droughts is different for 1930s kids living after or people in general living after the Dust Bowl, and then all the way to like 2010s kids living after the 2008 economic depression, and even today. But yeah,
That's interesting you bring up that point about Baum's original vision being intended for the 1850s.
mm-hmm.
You could argue that the film takes place around that time. Aside from
Yeah,
Miss Gulch's bicycle she rides around, there's not really much technological advances showcased in the film. It could take place from that era, at least late 1800s at best.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it probably does. I think setting wise, it's reminiscent of the 1830s, 1930s with the Dust Bowl. Sorry, but I think it could
I mean,
easily
the setting
also
is just.
take place earlier. What's that?
I mean, the setting is just mostly ambiguous. It's just supposed to get at like the
Yeah.
This is the American suburbs, like the working man and like the farms and stuff. Like you can really put it at any point. Besides the bicycle.
Just yeah,
You want to get granular about it.
I
Yeah, just
rural
rural Americana.
sepia, dead end, everything negative. Yeah,
Yeah, I
Yeah.
honestly don't know a lot about fashion in the 1930s or beforehand. I don't know if Judy Garland. I'm gonna have to
They wear a
consult
lot of
someone.
scarecrow outfits,
Yeah,
Tin Man outfits,
scarecrow outfits,
and Tin Man outfits and Cowardly Lion outfits.
lion
a lot
costumes,
of
A lot
lion
of a
outfits, a
lot
lot
of
of
munchkins.
lot
A
of
lot of
witch hats.
munchkins. Yeah. Oh, and also based on like the adaptation thing. So the Wizard of Oz is only adapting the first half of the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and we can dive into like differences between the novel and the book all day. I don't think it's really worth it. I think there are a couple that are really essential. Most notably is okay. This is like a bit of a rabbit hole that I'm not like super educated to get into, but still whatever. So the ruby slippers in the original novel, they were not ruby slippers, they were silver slippers. And so they changed that in my before diving deep into this. I personally think that they did it to one showcase the Technicolor and also to make the shoes like stand out with the whole yellow and blue, so to make this whole triangle of the color theory and the primary colors. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Why do you guys think they made silver slippers into red slippers? Well, not red, ruby
I,
slippers.
I think it's what you just said. I doubt there's any crazy. I mean, you can really start analyzing it any way you want, but I honestly think it's just to showcase the Technicolor, because
yeah.
it does look stunning.
Yeah, a very
It
iconic
definitely
shot.
it definitely shows up more vividly against the yellow brick road. You said it was silver originally in the novel.
Yeah, it was. And I also, to what you just said about the red, like red is like the color. Red, like just I don't know what the science behind this is, but red just grabs your attention immediately based on how it works.
Yeah.
That's why like stop signs are red because they're just red just grabs your attention so fast. And I do think that that's part of it. But
In
yeah,
liter
they're silver.
in literature, red does represent the color of desire
Yeah.
to the protagonist, to characters. I mean, we could talk when we do talk about Vertigo, we will definitely talk about how red represents
Yes.
desire. And that is definitely how the ruby slippers are presented within the film. They're the object of desire to the Wicked Witch of the West. That's her whole end all be all goal of the film is to extract those slippers from Dorothy's character. So it does make dramaturgical sense to change the color to red just because of that aspect of desire. But also it's just such a
Yeah.
it's such a visually striking color to see.
It is.
It's become iconic. We'll also talk about it in the red shoes. Just it's such an iconic piece of footwear to be seen. Not since the Air Jordans have we seen something so iconic.
Then red shoes. I mean, yeah, silver isn't really particularly cinematic for Technicolor.
And the ruby slippers are actually the most viewed thing in a museum in Washington D.C. I don't know where it was, but they like usually have to change the carpet in front of them many times a year because of how many people just stand there just looking at the red ruby slippers. It's one of the most iconic pieces of fashion ever, especially in film. And like talking about fashion and film,
And it's the original slippers in the
yeah,
museum.
the original ruby slippers, yeah. But yeah, and back to the silver thing now. Okay, so it's I don't know if Bill knows more about this. I mean, we've discussed this earlier, but were a lot of politics back in the 1890s when the novel was written on the gold standard against the silver standard. One politician who was very outspoken against the gold standard was William Jennings Bryan. And while that may sound random, like why I bring this politician up, he was actually the main inspiration behind the Cowardly Lion. He was, I think it was 1896 when he started his campaign for like the presidency, and he was opposing the war. I think it was the war against Spain, but I may be wrong. The Spanish American War. I may be wrong, but it's like late 1800s, early 1900s.
No, yes, late 1800s is correct.
And he was opposed to the gold standard and pro the silver standard. He also gave a very famous speech called the Cross of Gold. And how does this relate is that he is said to be the main inspiration behind the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz because of the whole aspect of he doesn't want to go to war. So in a way, he's like cowardly. Well, I wouldn't say that, but that's like what the interpretation says. And it has all these themes about like the gold standard and the silver standard and how all these like tie in between together.
I can just imagine Frank L. Baum just sitting on his chair thinking, God, wouldn't it be cool if I just put this completely meta symbolism in this slippers, make them silver, as if the silver standard is skipping right over the gold standard, saying, fuck you, we're not doing that.
So trivial.
I wonder. I know that Seattle is often referred to as the Emerald City. I wonder if it's because of the movie. I mean, I assume so, especially because Washington. I mean, Washington was a territory of the U.S. I don't know if it was already a state in 1896. They probably name it the Emerald City after the Emerald City in the Wizard of Oz. But that's an interesting.
By 1896, it was definitely a state.
I mean, Arizona wasn't a state until I think 1911, but that's like the third youngest state. So it's interesting. Another change that I think it's really interesting, but I think this is just for PG reasons. In the novel, the Wizard of Oz tells Dorothy and the gang like, "Oh, go kill the Wicked Witch of the West." But in the movie, he just goes like, "Oh, go bring me her broomstick."
They end up killing her regardless.
But it's less. Okay, yeah. So Seattle wasn't called the Emerald City until 1982. Yeah, it's a lot less dark too. Like oh, you 16-year-old, go 12-year-old maybe. I don't know how old Dorothy is supposed to be. Go kill a witch.
No, it's because definitely it's supposed to be more marketable movie. So that he's not just gonna order a hit on the Wicked Witch of the East.
Yeah. And another interesting thing about Baum was a terrible person. The Wicked Witch of the West is often seen as a representation of the dangerous West. Now that we're talking about the territories of Arizona and Washington and all that, the Wicked Witch of the West was seen as a representation of what's west of Kansas, right? And all the dangers that are left, as in like, oh, the cowboys and the Wild West and all these things. And Baum was actually pro-Native American genocide in like a racist way. That's what the winged monkeys are supposed to represent, like in a screwed up way, like Native Americans.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's a reading on the film. But yeah, he was outspokenly pro-Native American genocide. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the Wicked Witch of the West, in a way, represented all these dangers, and it made me wonder what is the Wicked Witch of the East. When Dorothy arrives at Oz, she kills the Witch of the East, which kind of I think implies that like, oh, the East is defeated, the British are defeated, as in like the Revolutionary War. Let's see what's west.
I could see that.
But that's just my take.
And the red slippers representing red coats.
I mean, you can also see it as like the East is conquered because like the whole movie's a journey. It just follows the American manifest destiny. Like we must travel down the yellow brick road and see.
That makes a lot of sense to me as well. I mean, the yellow brick road. Think of it like 1849. And I know that because of the 49ers, the gold rush of San Francisco.
Yeah, follow the yellow brick road.
It is so terrible that's like such a darkness is like hovering over the story.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to like discuss these topics of like what these things may need and not just like, oh, ignore them because it's been a while.
Yeah, no, of course.
And when it comes to like political representation of characters, you can see also in like the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, like if the Cowardly Lion, if this is William Jennings Bryan, the politician, you could also argue that like the Scarecrow is a representative of the farmers that were striking in the late 1890s, and so were the steel industry in the U.S. was failing because of international pressure. So it's all these things in America that are failing. It's kind of like the gold standard and the steel industry and the farmers are striking and all the awful things about America. And it's so ironic that they are still going down the yellow brick road to like manifest destiny and stuff like that. It's also interesting seeing it from these guys' perspective, as in they're also going down the road into getting what they want. And they are the ones fulfilling their desires.
Yeah, because another interesting thing is that like Dorothy and friends go through this entire journey, and at the end, it's like, oh, but you always could go home. Like it was always
Yeah,
so like the whole journey kind of didn't need to happen. I don't know if that's some sort of commentary on like if we're continuing down this narrative we're building on like manifest destiny and conquering. You know what I mean?
yeah. Honestly, I think it does. I think you can add it to the fact that like, oh, the satisfaction of being where you are, not actually needing to go on these to like find happiness.
Yeah.
And I think it plays into the desires of the other characters when they didn't actually need what they were like. They like, oh, the Cowardly Lion wants courage, and the Tin Man wants a heart, and the Scarecrow wants a brain. Like at the end of the day, the wizard doesn't give them like a brain and a heart and courage, whatever. He gives them a diploma, like a college diploma,
A war medal,
a war medal, yeah, for like bravery, and
a ticking testimonial.
he gives them all those things, which in reality is not a heart, a brain, and courage. It's just validation, and it comes to asking for the need of validation. I think it's one of the ways that the film could be interpreted. And also, just as a side note, I think it's really important to think like we can give off 20 interpretations, but there's going to be thousands and millions more. And you don't necessarily have to marry yourself to one interpretation. Like we can just discuss several different interpretations, and neither of them believe in none of them, because that's how art works. It's fun. But moving on, like whole thing, it's like they're kind of just given the validation, and it goes to show like all this important thing of like being told that you're in a way special, that you are smart, and that you are brave. And it also kind of shows this statement that's like, okay, education in this system, like the US system and whatever, it's like you're not gonna be smart unless you get a degree, and like all the pressures that they give you, or like you're not gonna be smart, you're not gonna be brave unless you like prove yourself in battle and die, and you're not gonna be loved unless like somebody gives you love. And it's like all these, I don't think they're like all these like kind of like toxic-esque ideas, then they believe it. And it also, it's like interesting because like these people are like, yeah, like they're being put in a bad situation, but they are also, but now they're able to benefit from their world. And that's just so, and it's very cathartic as like an audience member and for the characters in the movie, like to get through this moment.
All three characters, the Tin Man who wants a heart, the Lion who wants courage, and the Scarecrow who wants a brain. We already see them like in the climax of the film when they're like fighting the witch. You can already the Scarecrow outwits the witch. The Lion gains courage, and the Tin Man's like has a heartfelt involvement in all of this. So you can already see them gaining the attributes they want just by doing this struggle, but they don't feel validated until they get, as you said, those like those signs like of that society deems as like what is smart, what is like what is emotion and what is valor, like the war sign and the diploma. It's like like is it making a point of it, or is it like just kind of like going along with it? You know what I mean? I just think that's so interesting.
It kind of feels like they're indoctrinating societal standards of the time to their audience. Because
Yeah.
even though he gave him a ticking testimonial, he was about to call him a philanthropist, saying that that's the essence of kindness, at least what he defines it as. And then he says, a good deeder, after not wanting to say philanthropist. So I think that they are, in a sense, trying to tell people that in order to feel fulfilled, you have to gain these types of things in order to be considered courageous, in order to be considered an intellect, a diploma of thinking. Like
Yeah.
it's it's like second grade, like second grader knowledge, really, in how they're trying to write this type of indoctrination. That's the word that comes to my mind, at least when I think of that at the end.
That's interesting. To me, it feels more like a criticism of that. Like it's saying like you all had these all along, because the way that we start saying, like, it's like, oh, you were always smart, just that you didn't go to college, so here you go. And it's like, oh, the mathematic root of whatever. Same with the other two. He's like, yo, you were always brave, you always had a heart. And he goes like, oh, the heart is defined by like the love of the people around you that they have for you, and look at how your friends love you. And which is also like kind of validation and kind of problematic on its own way. I just think it's, I don't know, to me it felt kind of more hopeful than to be like, oh yeah, kids, go to college, like you don't have to listen to this. I mean, I think maybe more so after you grow up and watch it, like you were always smart in a way. But yeah.
To me, this movie also feels like a satire at points. One moment I can think of where I was like, okay, yeah, this definitely feels satirical is when they first approached the haunted forest and you could see the sign that said, I'd turn back if I were you. As if they're poking fun at like the evil lair, that type of archetype where characters have to go into bad territories. Um,
Yeah.
the whole idea of the facade wizard, but in parallel to the facade, Professor Marvel MCU reference, crazy 1939.
Whoa.
I really like those kinds of parallels between them. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. And the whole idea of like the man behind the curtain, which we can talk about later, and how that like is like a microcosm of like cinema itself. But like from the like a satire point of view and comedic point of view, I think it's really strong. I personally really like the joke when the Cowardly Lion is watching like the castle, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna do all the blah blah blah, and I just wanna need you, and I just need, I'm gonna do all this and rescue Dorothy and blah blah blah, and I just wanna ask you two guys one thing to talk me out of it. No, I definitely agree that the satirical like aspect of the movie is definitely there, and like yeah, with the whole, also with the whole aspect of like, oh, the great Wizard of Oz is actually just a guy, and it kind of makes it more powerful in a way. I also really like it subverts your expectations a lot when it comes to that. And just a quick tangent, I really like the beginning of the film when they kind of establish all three of the characters
Yes, I was about to say I really like that a lot.
in like rapid fast, I don't know, 9 8 minutes. They just introduce all the characters, like main thing, like, okay, the Scarecrow is dumb, the because he like
Yeah.
smashes his head, well, the human version, he like smashes his
Yeah,
hand with a
he's
hammer.
working on the wagon, repairing it, and yet his finger gets crushed and he's acting all clumsy. The lion, at first, he tries to save her in the pigsty, but then is more scared than she is and fully winded out. And then, of course, the Tin Man Hickory makes fun of Zeke, which just shows how unempathetic his character is, how apathetic.
Yeah, exactly. I
It's really
agree.
good. It's really great screenwriting. I mean,
It
you get
is.
19 people together in a room, I guess you're bound to get something good out of it.
One of them has at least one good idea.
It's
Yeah,
Mank.
and it's really good directors. I mean, Mank. It's interesting because I mean I did make a big thing of like 19 screenwriters, but most of them just drew drafts and they were like, oh, okay, your draft is worth nothing. I think Mank was one of them. He wrote like 25 pages, and then none of his scenes were actually added to the film. But yeah, I think it goes to show like a really strong direction from King Vidor, who directed the Kansas scenes.
I like that they saved that for last in the production. I think it made it all the more fulfilling. He's able to look back on the footage and then draw those kinds of parallels at a very breakneck pace at the beginning.
And an interesting thing also about the Kansas scenes in general is that every single scene in the movie, except for one, was shot inside a soundstage. So they shot every scene except for the opening credits, which are just like the clouds of Kansas.
Interesting.
I also really like the tornado scene. I think it's really funny with all the things flying, like
Yeah,
the through the window.
it's almost translucent, all of the things, because they're just trying to figure out green screen at the time. It's really interesting.
I know. Yeah, those are like some of the comedic beats that I really enjoyed. And another aspect of the film that I think is worth discussing is like the film as puberty, us as puberty, the going back from us to Kansas, as in like adulthood. but you're in this like phase in between childhood and adulthood. And some people say that like, oh, the friends represent Dorothy's friends represent children and like fellow children and friends and stuff like that, and how they all are working together to work towards his goal. And her shoes are adulthood, and like she always had the capability of becoming an adult, as we all do. And it's just a matter of like having to believe in yourself and learning all the lessons that you are actually able to become an adult, and through this process of puberty. Oh, I also really like the visual effects. I think they make it feel more authentic to like the dream of a child, even if they're not
Yeah.
like completely realistic.
No, it definitely feels like a children's book come alive.
Yeah, exactly. That's a
It
great way of
holds
putting
up.
it.
It holds up a lot, pretty well. Like it's exactly like reading like what I imagine reading the Wizard of Oz book would be like. Like you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Oh
It's
yeah,
so
absolutely.
interesting.
An effect I really love is the introduction of Glinda's character, how she comes out of nowhere, appears from a bubble.
I think it's really powerful. And like a really powerful image. And we never talked about Glinda, but I think she's an interesting character, especially considering the whole idea of like, oh, East being the defeated side, West being the wild to come.
North being the
Um,
good.
yeah, North being the good, the Canada, basically. Or you can also
What's
see this North as in like the Civil War,
I was
the
thinking of it
Union.
through the
Yeah.
Civil War's lens, yeah. Especially since the book was written in the 1800s, post Civil War. But there's no elaboration at all about the South and what there is there.
No.
What do you have any thoughts?
Like maybe it's meant to stay like ambiguous, and maybe there's a Wicked Witch of the South, or maybe there's just another good witch.
Maybe it's Bravos.
I mean, it's Mexico. Maybe they
Yeah.
just didn't know what to do about Mexico.
They didn't know what to do about Dorne.
Yeah, it's torn.
Okay.
God damn. Like it's not even me or Eugene saying this.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I
I think.
really like the dynamic of the witch characters within this lore, like within the world building. Just the idea about of the Dorothy entering this fantastical world through a murder. That's how she's introduced, is by killing someone, which is really it's really dark, but I wonder, so you said earlier, Souffle, that the story begins with the East being conquered, the East being killed, because she was a wicked witch of the East being killed by the house falling on top of her, and that's just very interesting to me. On a
Yeah.
rewatch, especially, I was thinking about the witch dynamic, how each witch kind of controls each territory.
Hmm.
Say what you know what, even though she died, say what you will about the Wicked Witch of the East, whatever, sure she was wicked, but the Munchkin town looked very peaceful. It looked very chill, colorful even. She was
Yeah.
the OG red slipper wearer. So, I don't know. I'd like to meet the Witch of the East. Maybe she was kind of chill. Maybe she was
Well, they're
just got a bad rep.
they're peaceful because they were liberated.
But it was very colorful souffle. I don't
I
understand.
know. It's
Yeah.
colorful because they got liberated.
It-
Maybe it looks just like
maybe
Kansas.
maybe it was sepia before.
I think another really interesting theme is the whole concept of, and more so than when it came out like a few years later in 1946 when the movie kind of resurfaced. It's the whole idea of there's no place like home. That's probably what the soldiers of every country in the World War II were thinking. Like there's no place like home, really. Like I want to go home. And like people were like, "Oh, let's go to war. Let's go." Like Dorothy was like, "Oh, let me leave Kansas." She tried to escape Kansas. But then she's like, "Oh, there's no place like home. I want to go home, home, home." Like it goes to like the propaganda of World War One and World War Two, where like war was, well, mostly pre World War One, but war was seen as like an adventure of like, oh, make friends, defeat the enemy. But in reality, it was awful, especially during the trenches on World War One, which is full of sickness and death. And of course, war has always been terrible, but World War One kind of recolored the perception of war from like an adventure standpoint, and then World War II made it even worse. It goes back to what we were saying earlier about like how through generations you can just keep applying this like all the way to today. Hundreds of people, like, the messages just like live on forever. And how like it gets recolored, no pun intended, 7 years after its release, and then it gets recolored again 10 years after that. And then it keeps getting like the perception on the movie keeps changing and changing and changing, and that's so interesting how it's able to live like that.
It definitely makes sense why it's considered one of the most influential of all time, just because of that feeling it embodies, especially in that generation post World War II, the children who grew up hearing stories of their fathers going overseas, their mothers in Europe especially, and in the Pacific. I agree with you, Eugene. War is not good, especially World War One, World War Two, and history does repeat itself, so does the outlook of multiple generations. That's why this film is so timeless. You could argue in the 2000s with the Iraq War as well. Vietnam in the 60s, while it was playing through the television. Television was huge in Vietnam, so was The Wizard of Oz, like you said. It's interesting how the psychology of war can feed into a joyous film like this.
And not only in like America, look at the world right now. Look at Yemen, Israel and Palestine, and Ukraine and Russia and the Red Sea. Look at all those places, and like those people want to be home rather than fighting. And like it's just such a message that like I think really would resonate with the entire world.
Go back to that
And that's
nostalgia.
why it have for
Yeah,
almost for like an 80, 90 years plus.
yeah, and not even war. Like you don't even have to go that far. Think of like going to work and just wanting to be home, or leaving your family for whatever reason, because there are many reasons, like just I'm not talking about abandonment, but like just you just can't be with your family anymore, or where you grew up, like moving away from where you grew up.
Yeah.
um and like even earlier, as we were saying, like childhood, Dorothy comes into this place to kind of become more of herself, and find what she really values, which is home. But eventually she's gonna grow up, and adults won't help, and she will stop being a child, and home will no longer like exist. Some people would say like, oh, you have to face them alone, but in the heart of the movie, it's like you can ask your friends to help you. And something so beautiful I found about this movie is that everybody wants, all the four main characters want the other three to succeed. They're not only going there on their own, they're going there together. They're not like all being like, oh yes, we'll help Dorothy go get what she wants. They all have something to gain, and they're all supporting one another. And that's kind of the goal. It's like everybody to be content. Like look at the end of the movie. The Cowardly Lion, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Man all get what they wanted. They still ask like, oh, but what about Dorothy? And I think it's just such a good message for like children of like you can ask your friends for help. You can all help each other out. It's gonna work out, and like it's kind of reassuring for children. And like even if it's like, oh, you won't be, it's kind of scary, oh, you're not smart enough if you are not told so or whatever. It's like if you have friends, they can give you that validation and that recognition that we all, even if it's like, oh, asking for validation is looked down upon. I think it's important to like sometimes you just need it as a human being. You just need to be loved and cherished and recognized for what you are and what you do. And I think it's so powerful how like through friendship this has blossomed, which I don't know, I just think it's very beautiful.
Yeah, and it's also very much so a movie about overcoming your own insecurities and just that you can kind of be anything you want and just have to find it in your soul. I think, we talked a lot about how like propaganda it is, but yeah, you're right. It does have like good messages for children and just good family values in general. That's why it's stuck around for so long.
Yeah, and it talks about like about like achieving your goals from like an introvert to not look outside but to look inside to see need. Like you already are smart. Everybody listening already is like smart and has a heart and has courage. You know what I mean? It's just a matter of you believing it yourself in a way. And sometimes you just need help to recognize that and to know that.
Yeah, I kind of feel speechless after that monologue you just
No,
gave,
thank
Eugene.
you.
That was a very beautiful interpretation of the film, to be honest. That was really good.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I agree.
I feel like we've yet to touch on I hate that I'm the one to bring this up, but I feel like we've yet to touch on the horrific elements of The Wizard of Oz because
Okay.
even though I did grow up with this film, I did view it from a lens where it can be a little disturbing at times.
It
And I
is.
think that there are a few moments in the film and a moment that's cut out and totally makes sense why it is cut out that definitely aid in that sense that when you leave your home, when you leave your source of safety, your safety net to go on this adventure, to go on this coming of age tale, you're going to be exposed to the world completely. And the world is a fantastic place. There are lots of beautiful things to witness, but there's also terrible things, terrible people, disturbing situations you're going to find yourself in, very unknown. We've talked about the Wicked Witch of the West. That's the most obvious, but there's some moments in the film that are kind of disturbing. I don't know. There's one moment where they do go into Emerald City. I don't know if it's the tone of it or not, but when they're going through the spa, the Tin Man is getting shined up. The lion is there's about a dozen giant oversized scissors around the lion. Dorothy's asking, "Oh, you can inject dye into my eyes to turn it a different color?" And they're like, "Yeah." And everyone just starts laughing. It's like this shared laughter that goes on for quite a bit. I know that in the film it's supposed to be a joyous thing to be able to dye your eyes a different color at this place, but something about the interpretation of it really kind of disturbs me. And the scene that got cut out that I do want to talk about is called the jitterbug scene, where the witch puts a spell onto the gang, the four characters as they're journeying to the Emerald City. She puts a spell on these bugs called jitterbugs that make them dance until they die. It's almost shot like found footage, like a backrooms
Lynch
concept.
DV.
It's oh yeah, like 144p, like just the absolute bare minimum of pixelation. It's not from the camera's perspective, it's someone filming off to the side, like in the rafters through trees. You see them dancing around and all these bugs flying over them, and they're like screaming almost in an agony while they're dancing and singing the jitterbug tune. And the
Oh
jitterbug
my
tune
god.
itself kind of reminds me of like Mr. Sandman, Bring Me a Dream, that song, or Jeepers Creepers, more specifically. There's a lot of elements to this movie that just feel just disturbing. That's my interpretation of it though, because there are a lot of joyous things. And I agree almost wholeheartedly with what you said, Eugene, about the wholesomeness of it, the idea of companionship and wanting to pursue goals together, and this sense of adventure that I think everyone should experience for sure. But it's also a cautionary tale that you will meet these boundaries that that will question yourself and your morals. I don't know. Do any of you feel kind of a disturbing element or factor into the film, aside from the Wicked Witch of the West, which is the most obvious?
Yeah.
I mean, the movie itself is just inherently dark by like just what the original source, quote unquote, source material is like based on. You know what I mean? Like things we've already talked about. There's already like this kind of, and all the things in production, everything behind it. There's already like a dark like aura to it. Like even things we don't see in the film that have kind of these years of later. It feels as magical as it is. It also feels cursed in a way, if that makes sense.
It is very creepy in some ways. Honestly, the ways the people, the like citizens of Oz are dressed, It's pretty creepy. Like the Munchkins and also the people from Oz, the city, like their big noses and stuff. It's
Something that
just.
kind of disturbs me too,
Mhm.
or just a thing I've noticed, especially on this recent rewatch, because I watched the film about 3 times in prep for this, is that each authoritarian figure in Emerald City is played by the same actor, the man who plays Oz and Professor Marvel, Frank Morgan. He plays the doorman, he plays the stagecoach driver, and he plays the guard and soldiers at the front of Oz's building, including Oz himself in his throne room, of course. But it kind of reminds, it's like, I don't know, it's almost like a Men vibe where we're just seeing this same guy over and over again, but in different hairstyles, different accents, different costumes. And of course, there is that obvious parallel between Hunk, Hickory, and Zeke being the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. But to see Frank Morgan play so many roles, I think he played about 6 or 7, if I'm not mistaken, especially all those authoritarian figures. I feel like they're definitely trying to say something about the uniformed look.
Yeah, it is very creepy. I just think it kind of pulls the rug out of that and then kind of changes it when at the end of the day we learned that the Wizard of Oz was just human, and like even him is just human, the almighty, all powerful wizard. I think it's kind of like as is you get presented with these like awful things or like these very challenging things, and then it turns out that it's more human than you initially thought it was.
It does bring a sense it does bring a sense of comfort when we get revealed that the Wizard of Oz is just any other man. It speaks
And it's also
greatly
funny.
to yeah, it plays as a joke, but it also speaks to authoritarian figures in general, just to remind the audience and to children that no matter how powerful these people try to perceive themselves, they are above all else just regular human beings that feel the same way we do.
I like that, actually. I like that interpretation of it.
So the jitterbug scene, there's only like footage of someone recording from the background. We don't have like the actual.
Nope.
I want to see that. That
It's very creepy. Yeah. Just all you have to do is Google Wizard of Oz jitterbug. It'll show up on YouTube. It's very creepy, not gonna lie.
While we're on the topic, I wanted to talk about the music of the film because we talked a little bit about how MGM musicals were like such a big part.
Oh my god. I think the Wizard of Oz and their soundtrack is one of my favorites, honestly. Especially
real.
on this most
I love it
recent
too.
rewatch. Each song is just really impactful, I think. There's so many bangers I don't even bangers to describe the music funny. But yeah, there's so many. Like even some lesser songs like If I Were King of the Forest, the Lions song before they enter the room. Merry Old Land of Oz is great. Even the soldiers, oh wee oh. Who was it that did the music, Eugene? I'm spacing.
Okay, so the composer is Harold Arlen and Herbert Stothart. Those are the two composers. And then Harold Arlen also wrote the music, like the lyrics, as well as E.Y. Harburg. None of them really were that famous outside of this movie. Some of them worked in, Arlen worked with Judy Garland later in A Star Is Born, as well as Love Affair. Well, this is not with Judy Garland, but Love Affair and The Country Girl.
Hmm.
While
Okay.
Herbert Stothart was, I think it was him who was part of A Night at the Opera with the Marx Brothers. I also am a really big fan of the music. I like when they're like, "Oh, follow the yellow brick road." I really like that scene,
Hmm.
music wise. That gets stuck in my head, and also the "We're off to see the wizard."
The
Uh,
Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
I also
exactly.
love how each of the 3 men, the Scarecrow, the Tin
Yeah.
Man, and the Lion, all have the exact same song, the exact same type of um, instrumental beat and tone, but with different lyrics. You know, if I only had the nerve, if I only had a heart, if I only had a brain, but they're able to make it work so cohesively that you could feasibly listen to those 3 songs back to back and it would feel like one similar song, which is really cool. But each actor kind of has a different tone to it, like a slight iteration that does make it unique to themselves, which I love. Like, of course, the Cowardly Lion is pronounces his words all off and weird. Bert Lahr's like, if I only had the noive, which is funny and
No,
adds a great
yeah,
comedic tone to it. Jack
yeah,
Haley actually has a very beautiful voice. So even though he plays like a cold-hearted Tin Man, he honestly has the most vibrant of the three. And then, Jack Haley is just very wild and sporadic, much like his character and his physical acting. We haven't talked really about the physical acting between the three, but Jack Haley is so good as the Tin Man, where he's especially when they first oil him up and he has to like
Oh yeah,
move in
yeah.
a certain way and like bends around and tips over and like he's doing the robot throughout the whole film. Ray Bolger as the Scarecrow is fucking almost
he's
phenomenal.
incredible.
How sporadic he is. He's like Fred Astaire, really, in how wild his movement and dancing is. These were such talented people playing these characters.
Exactly. Ray Bolger doesn't even like. I am convinced that he was made out of hay. He doesn't move like a person.
The mask is so good.
But yeah, all three of them have like. I like the performances as a whole of every actor in the movie. Like Margaret Hamilton does a really
Oh,
iconic job as the Wicked Witch of the West.
we haven't really even touched on Margaret Hamilton yet because she's
I
fucking
know
amazing. And
she's
just
amazing.
she's an incredible person in real life too. Like such a
I
sweet
know.
person. There's some stories I read about her and how she would often go to bookstores or schools and do public readings of the book to children and do her witch voice, but also try to acknowledge to the children that would have nightmares of her character that the Wicked Witch wasn't real, that they don't have to really be afraid of her and they can still enjoy the movie when knowing that it's just her playing a character. And I love the approach she had with the mind of a child, especially in the aftermath of the film, and especially the way she was treated during the production. Like fucking awful
Yeah.
how she was treated. She had like a raggedy old trailer for her dressing room and she was hospitalized for burns that she had when she made her exit at the Munchkin town. When the fire went off originally, it caught her on fire and she had to be hospitalized for that. The green paint, of course, causing so much irritation. If I'm not mistaken, it was copper paint, which is just ugh. It's so carcinogenic. It's a fucking
Yeah.
wonder none of these actors passed away from like early onset cancer from that film. But Margaret Hamilton was such a joy of a human being, and I
Yeah.
definitely loved her performance. If I had to pick one performance in the film that was like the best and the most iconic, I would pick her over Judy Garland because the
Definitely.
Wicked Witch is so iconic in the depiction of villainous characters in cinema. You could even argue like she's like Darth Vader's fucking influenced by the Wicked Witch. There's so much to her
Yeah.
character that I love.
She's incredible in the film. Yeah, well, I think you said everything about her that I wanted to say as well, that I share. Like, I think everyone was great. Also, Judy Garland was really great
Oh yeah, she
in
was
the
good.
movie. Yeah.
Toto was the best.
Toto was
Total was,
fucking off the charts.
yeah, that's why they paid him like $5,000 a week. For real, for
Yeah.
real.
That's
Meanwhile, Frank Morgan showed up to set drunk every day. That's what I heard.
really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That actually kind of fits with his character, not gonna lie.
Yeah, when you stop and think about it for a second.
And when it comes to the music, I really like that bit when they're like running through the forest and she's like lions and tigers and bears. Oh my! And she like insists on saying "oh my" after every single line.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I watched it, it cracked me up because of how like absurd it is. But it's so it's so like golden age of Hollywood to just be like "oh my, oh my, oh my." It's so absurd, but I love it. It's one of my favorite parts. And we, of course, we have to talk about Over the Rainbow, arguably the most influential song of all time. Most definitely the most influential song in cinema history.
Yes.
I think it was
Yeah,
voted the best song of the 20th century by
interesting.
someone.
I was looking into it because Judy Garland is considered, like Barbara Streisand was considered, a
Yeah.
gay icon. Same thing with Judy Garland. Like that the origin of the rainbow flag probably might lead to like the rainbow song. Like
Yeah, because the rainbow flag for representing the gay community, especially,
yeah,
was made in the 1970s, and some people argue that it was indirectly inspired by Over the Rainbow. Not like the designers were thinking about Over the Rainbow, but like since like Judy Garland in general had become so popular among gay people, which is really interesting, especially how like culturally important the flag is today. And yeah, and like outside of that, it's a really powerful song. I've heard a story that like they were initially gonna cut out the song of the movie, but then they screened it. Yeah, I think it was Melvin Leroy, and I think it was Victor Fleming, and like they when they saw it, they started crying, and so they went to the head of MGM who didn't want the song because they needed to make the movie shorter, and they were like, no, you have to keep it here. And then he was like, okay, let them have their song, and it ended up becoming one of the most important pieces of music of all time. But yeah, I think well, it's a really great song. It's a really beautiful scene. It's a really iconic scene. Yeah, and Judy Garland is amazing performing that song.
She is. Not just the soundtrack, but the sound design in the film is also tremendous. I I really love the use of the voice actors bellowing the gusts of wind throughout the film. It only happens about three times, but each occasion just feels really, just like powerful. At the beginning, the
Hmm.
ooh, like there's something about that that really intrigues me and just kind of sets the tone for how fantastical the film is and like this whirling wind of adventure that's to come. And of course, like sound design use for like the Tin Man having that sound of him creaking around while he's doing his dancing or trying to move his mouth is just
Yeah, the
great.
oil.
The oil,
yeah, when they're oiling him.
yeah. The sound design is fantastic in my opinion. Like just whoever everything there's so much just so much technicality to the film that I adore and is just really
Especially for
timeless to
him.
the to today.
It's such a like ode to creativity and a statement on the power of cinema that was so needed
It's just
in the
crazy
1930s.
because there's no auteur attached to it, but it's like such a creative film.
Exactly. It is so many of the images are so iconic. Oh, I wanted to mention earlier, way earlier, the scene with the snow. It's so beautiful. Like it's so cozy. It's so weird. And like I don't know, the snow. I know the snow was like toxic or whatever, but it's just so. It's such a powerful scene. I don't know. I really love it. I don't know if you guys have one thing to say, but I wanted to bring this last thing up. The 1925 film. I don't know if you guys had heard of it, um, but this is not the first adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. There was one made in 1925. I think it was called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It may have just been called The Wizard of Oz. Of course, it was a silent film because talkies didn't exist back then. And no, it's just called The Wizard of Oz. It was directed by Larry Simon. Larry Simon is the director, and he plays the Scarecrow. I haven't seen it, but people say that he made the Scarecrow into the main character of the movie, which is really funny. And the actress who plays Dorothy was actually married to Larry Simon.
Kind of sounds like an ego trip to me.
I wouldn't be opposed to watching it. Like I'm not gonna draw a judgment on the movie before watching it. The poster looks very bleak. I'll say that.
Oh, yeah, that poster looks
Yeah,
very bad.
looks horrifying.
Larry Seaman in The Wizard of Oz. That's terrible. He's just the Scarecrow is the main character. I wonder how. God, I've
Yeah,
never really heard about this film before, to be honest. So
yeah. The 25 Wizard of Oz. Yeah, I mean it
maybe we.
makes sense. People didn't like it back then. So we're back. I was gonna ask you guys, now that we're nearing the end of the discussion, I want to ask what is your personal experience with the film through your life? Like, when's the first time you watched it? How has it influenced your life in any ways? Like, I can go first. The first time I watched The Wizard of Oz was when I was, what was it, 15 years old, 14 years old. I had a summer where I just watched a bunch of classic movies. I was having fun. I watched like Casablanca, Psycho, Vertigo, Chinatown, Rare Window, Citizen Kane, It's a Wonderful Life. And one of the movies that I watched was, of course, The Wizard of Oz. And when I watched it, I really, really loved it back then. I still really love it. Love it. I think it used to be one of my favorite movies. I don't know if I can still say that. I think it definitely influenced my appreciation for older films. I already appreciated them, but it took it to like a new level, and it made me start realizing all these like things that like all golden age Hollywood like movies share, and I really appreciated it for that at the time. The more I think about it, the more I think it's a really beautiful and creative and powerful movie, and I personally really enjoy it. I think it's really funny. I think my favorite scene is, I mentioned it before, but it's probably the scene with the snow. I love that scene, even if it's brief. But yeah, I don't know. How do you guys feel, and what's your experience with the film through your life?
I grew up with this film ever since I was 4, 5 years old. I remember watching it for the first time. It was during a dark time in my life because I remember it was the same year my grandmother passed away, as well as my mom's best friend. We lost a house we were living in. We kind of moved to a different state. There was a lot going on in my life, but it was the first time I went to Legoland, so that was also a good time as well. But I just remember that part of my life so distinctly, and I remember seeing that movie, and it was good when I first saw it. I thought it was great. I thought it was very beautiful, wild, wacky. Loved the Tin Man's character quite a bit at the time. And then since then, I had watched it periodically at school. The elementary school I went to, they would show it for the entire school in the gymnasium. So I must have seen it about 6 times because they'd show it every year. They showed other films too. They had like a little mini film festival thing going on. They showed Scooby Doo, Shrek, some real bangers, really, truly.
All con films.
All con films. Yeah, that's true. Shrek was at con. To me, The Wizard of Oz has always been one of the most influential films to me growing up. And as I've gotten older, I will be honest, it's lessened in my head just because of the behind the scenes, the production of the film, the making of it, and just that it's introduced me to other musicals and other films that I personally love more. I could argue that this film sort of introduced me to Gene Kelly and Singing in the Rain, which then introduced me to Jacques Demy with the young girls of Rochefort, and then because of the obviousness of it, introduced me to The Red Shoes. All of those films I really truly love and adore a lot more than The Wizard of Oz, but I can't help but respect the film for what it's done to cinema as a whole. It is without a doubt one of the best movies ever made because of that. But if I were to if I were nowadays, if I were to choose any other movie to watch with The Wizard of Oz, I probably would choose, I would choose a Jack Demme musical over The Wizard of Oz. I would choose something else from my childhood. It wasn't over the course of my life, it has lessened, but I do still appreciate the film for what it is. I know Eugenio doesn't do ratings. I'm going to do a rating. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 with a heart because I do think this is a tremendous movie. And I hear the
Art is
laugh.
important.
I hear the laugh. Okay, I need to hear. Now I got to hear Souffle's thoughts right out the bat.
You see, for me, when it comes to this film, I don't think I was ever quite fond of it as a child. I definitely watched it with my dad because I grew up watching a lot of like these classics like Casablanca and such because my dad was studying to be in film when I was like around 10. So I definitely watched The Wizard of Oz around then, but like it was a film that never struck a chord with me. Maybe it's because I hate American politics. Who knows? But or because I hate musicals. But rewatching it, given the context of its time, I think it's just a super fascinating piece of not just American history, but like of art in general. And it's endlessly fascinating to talk about, to dissect all the minutia behind the set and all how like influential it's been for like filmmakers like David Lynch, and just for like how influential it's been for like the LGBTQ community. Like it just so this movie has touched a chord with like so many people. It's so interesting. But like as for the movie itself, not particularly my cup of tea, even though t- it's a technical marvel and like has a fascinating backstory. The story is just not my cup of tea. I won't do ratings for this podcast because I think ratings are a tad bit arbitrary, but those are my 2 cents on it.
I'm glad we could all share this. And yeah, like part of why I don't do ratings is because things change a lot in time.
Yeah.
Especially, I think the more I think about a movie, the less I'm inclined to give it a rating. But I think it's completely fair. I'm not anti ratings. I'm not pro ratings.
No, me neither.
I don't do them myself. But I love that people do them as a form of self expression.
You guys are gonna look forward to my ratings every episode. I don't give a
Yeah.
fuck. I'm going to do it. If I hate a movie that we're gonna talk in this podcast, I'm gonna give it a 1, a 2, or a 3. Okay, I gotta do it.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
I
that's
gotta
gonna be
do
the
it.
average rating. The average rating for The Wizard of Oz, I guess,
The
was
rating is
8.
gonna be mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
that's gonna be every Godard episode we do. Bill's just gonna be like, "This is like the worst thing ever."
Hey, careful. Spoilers.
Okay, and going
Sorry.
back to the very beginning as to the silent sound list, we cannot discuss this as a whole, but what makes it deserve its place in the list, on the canon, like throughout the years, what makes it stand out and be worthy of being recognized?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying. I don't think it'll ever be not on this list.
Yeah, I mean, even though it fell out of the top 100,
Wait, what's its place exactly?
108.
102. Oh, that's that's not
Okay,
concerning. I don't think it'll ever leave this list for hundreds of years. It's just such like a foundational piece of like cinema. Like I don't think this or like something like Citizen Kane will ever leave the list.
it's important to say it's at 108, but it's tied with another 5 films, which are Goodbye Dragon Inn, directed by Simon Liang, Wild Strawberries, directed by Ingmar Bergman, Touch of Evil, directed by Orson Welles, Man Who Shot Liberty Balance, directed by John Ford, Bring Your Baby, directed by Howard Hawks.
Goodbye Dragonin voted number 10 by Simon Liang.
And now, to define what's gonna be the movie for next week. So at the end of every episode, each of us is gonna present one film from the list, from the 250 movies, and then we're gonna spin a wheel to see which of the 3 films we're gonna discuss next week. That way, we get a little bit of control while also keeping like a random aspect to this thing. And so, for example, my pick for next week is gonna be the 1944 film directed by Billy Wilder, Double Indemnity, which is number 196 on the list.
I'm going with a film that's off my watch list. I've wanted to see it for a very long time. It is 1970s Wanda, written, directed, and stars Barbara Loden. This is the only film she has directed, and I'd like to check it out. Seems really interesting. It's about after a string of abusive relationships, Wanda abandons her family and seeks solace in the company of a petty criminal. I don't know anything else other than that, and I do know that Souffle really loves that film
One
and
of my favorites.
he speaks highly of it, and I'm very intrigued to check it out.
Okay, I just figured out what the placement was. Wanda was 48. If anyone
Yeah, Wonder Woman
cared,
48.
and the movie I want to recommend for next week is Killer of Sheep, which is number 44 on the list. It's pretty much the foundational film of the LA Rebellion, which is a group of African American UCLA students bringing like the cinema verite kind of like bootstraps like filmmaking, and it's just very. I just think it's a super fascinating piece of film history that gets oftentimes ignored, and I think Killer Sheep. I've seen a lot bits and pieces of it in film class, and I've always wanted to watch it. I love Charles Burnett. To Sleep with Anger, I think is amazing, and yeah, I think it would make a great discussion piece. So shall we spin it?
Okay, let's spin the wheel. Who's gonna spin the wheel? I have a wheel.
I
Souffle
have
has
it
a
pulled
wheel, I
up.
think. Okay, you spin it.
Yeah, I have it. Okay.
All right, I see
Okay,
it
we'll trust you.
for
I see
sure.
it.
I see it.
I doubt mine is gonna win, so I trust.
Let's
Okay.
see.
And the other two movies are my favorites, so it's a I win either way, really. Okay, so 3, 2, 1, spin.
Whoa.
Going.
Whoa.
It's going so fast.
Well, congratulations to Bill. Wanda's the
Oh,
winner.
yes. Can finally
I had a
watch
feeling it was
Wanda.
going to be.
It's a short
I
movie too.
Ever
It's
since we were
short.
discussing this podcast and the idea of doing a wheel spin, that was my pick. That's been my pick since day one of us talking about the wheel spin. So I'm glad that won.
Yeah, I'm so excited to revisit it. It's such a inspirational film to me.
Yeah, I'm also a huge fan of like a lot. I'm also a huge fan of like discussing women filmmakers, especially nowadays, and the history of women filmmakers. So I'm really excited to discuss Wanda.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about it more, but like, it's a movie
Yeah.
that so to me it was like so underseen. Like the
It is.
reason I discovered it was because I saw the Criterion cover of it and it looked interesting, and I bought it, and I was like, oh my god, this movie's amazing. I've never heard of it before.
When I watched it, I had heard a little bit about it, but I wasn't like that familiar with it. I'm looking forward to watching it and discussing it next week.
Oh yeah, me too.
Likewise.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
We want to thank our Patreons.
Yeah.
And I think our patrons are 100,000 patrons. We just crossed that milestone. Thank you guys so much for your
Thank you to Bob
support.
Iger for producing this podcast.
Subscribe to our Venmos.
Subscribe
Subscribe.
subscribe to Souffle's Foot Finder account. It's popping off.
That is
Get
not
some-
true.
He's
Do not
gonna
listen
leak.
to this man.
If he gets 100 more followers, he's gonna leak his big toe on Twitter. You're gonna have to check it out.
What do you know? Do not listen to him. It's literally blasphemous.
Well,
See you next time.